Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Well, thanks very much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Alex Vatanka. I'm a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, just around the corner, not far from here. It's a delight to see you all here. And what a wonderful panel we have managed to organize for you. It's on the issue of assessing Iran's policies in the Arab world. And I hope you all agree that you couldn't have timed it better. Certainly with what's happening in Yemen, everyone wants to know what is Tehran's ultimate objective in that country in southern Arabian Peninsula. Before we go ahead and start with the panel, let me say a few words about our panelists. You have the bios, but I will just say a few words and then tell you about the division of labor here this afternoon. With your permission, I will say a few words. I'll lay the ground by putting my Iranian hat on and tell you about the debate inside Tehran. What is the discussion like in Tehran today? What I will say is the debate in Tehran actually is not uniform. There is disagreement about where to go from here, from now onwards, but the question is who has the upper hand. I'll say something about it, and Alireza Nader at the end will also develop that thesis. We'll start with Harith al Qarawee, a fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University. Harith will be looking at the nature of sectarian politics in Iraq today, and I'm sure you've all read his material, has written extensively on sectarian politics of Iraq. From Iraq, we'll turn southwards. We'll go to Ambassador LeBaron, who'll be looking at the GCC's views on Iran. Ambassador LeBaron is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council with special focus on the Gulf region. He was the U.S. ambassador to Kuwait between 2004 and 2007. Then we'll go to MEI's own Randa Slim, who will be talking about Syria. And if she has time, she promises me to also talk a bit about Lebanon. Both countries obviously very interesting from the perspective of what the Iranians are up to. Randa is the director of Track 2 Dialogue Initiative at the Middle East Institute and a regular visitor to Tehran, which makes her a rarity in Washington, D.C. So I'm sure you all have lots of questions for her. Last but not least, we'll turn to Alireza Nader, who is a senior international policy analyst at Rand Corporation. Alireza has a focus on Iranian foreign policy, so we share that same interest. Alireza will be talking about and again, there is a big question mark. If there is a nuclear deal between the world and Iran, what would Iranian regional policy look like in the region? So Alireza has kindly agreed to talk about, what those scenarios might look like. But as I said, before I go to Harith, let me just say a few words about Iran's Arab policy. And let me take you back to August, or actually I should take you back to July of 2013. I remember vividly sitting down with a group of Arab friends in Dubai and watching the last presidential debate among the 8 candidates. And it was very curious to see the one issue that stood out among these remaining candidates was the nature of Iranian foreign policy. So you had Hassan Rouhani, the guy who ended up winning the election, obviously, making a very powerful point that they needed to change their policy across the board. And that would be a mistake to just focus on Iran's nuclear file, that they needed to expand beyond that and talk about the poor relations they have, particularly with some of the neighbors in places like Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Gulf. So he made that point very clearly during that debate. He made promises, but then you've had him in the presidency for about 20 months, and he hasn't really delivered on the promise of reaching out to the Arabs. We can debate it. I'm sure we're going to debate it in terms of, who's to be blamed for that. But if you follow Iranian media and developments in that country, it's very obvious. He's made more inroads in European capitals he's done in terms of Abu Dhabi and Riyadh and so forth. I also say this about Rouhani. He picks his fights very carefully. This is not Mohammad Khatami nor is he Ahmadinejad. He's very careful about how he picks his fights. And he's very clearly decided that the one issue he needs to focus on for now, till it yields results, is on the nuclear file. And going beyond that, at the moment, politically for him back in Tehran is not seen feasible. He just doesn't think he has it in him to question some of the other sort of pillars of Iranian regional policy, including the country's relations with Saudi Arabia. So you have to appreciate who the man is, where he's coming from, and the lesson he learned from watching the guys who came before him, particularly Ahmadinejad and Khatami, who upset the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Rouhani doesn't want to make the same mistake. He's picking his fights very carefully. So when we're looking in terms of what is in the way of Hassan Rouhani's, if we get to a point where there is an Iranian desire to turn the page with some of the Arab rivals in the region, what's in his way? One, as I said, is his mandate. Does he have a mandate from the supreme leader to go ahead with that? I have my big doubts that the supreme leader wants to give him that kind of a mandate. The supreme leader sends the nice, polished Iranian diplomats from the foreign ministry, the likes of Javad Zarif, to Geneva, and they're there, or in Switzerland this week, and that's the mandate they have, to resolve the nuclear standoff with one key objective in mind, to have those sanctions lifted. And everybody agrees with that, and that makes sense. But who is actually doing Iranian implementation of Iranian foreign policy in the region, places like Iraq and Syria? Well, as you all know, it's not Javad Zarif and his people from the foreign ministry. It's the guys with the guns and uniform from the IRGC, from the Revolutionary Guards. Those are the guys in Iraq today. And to my mind, Ayatollah Khamenei has no desire to reduce their role at the moment. The role of the Revolutionary Guards, because that's been their portfolio. That's what they've been doing for a very long time. That's what they're good at. So the conventional wisdom will tell us in Tehran. Big question is, what happens when suddenly you have events like we've seen this week in Yemen? What happens when Iran is suddenly confronted with Egypt, Turkey, and the GCC states ganging together to go in and stop what they perceive to be an Iranian invasion or intervention in Yemen? What does that do to the calculations if you're sitting in Tehran? The rise of ISIS certainly has helped also the hardliners in Tehran. They don't believe that the moderates, the likes of Hassan Rouhani, have anything to offer when it comes to the issue of fighting ISIS. Again, that weakens Rouhani's hand too. But fundamentally, you got to, again, ask this question. If people that have been on the fence in terms of Iran's role in the region, and I mean, just this week, President Erdogan pretty much called Iran officially an enemy of Turkey. This is pretty big. If the foreign minister of UAE, who is not necessarily the most of the hawks out there in the question of Iran, comes and talks about Yemen as a turning point, this is the beginning of a whole new era in Arab military cooperation in the region. When you're sitting in Tehran and you hear this sort of message, it's not from the usual suspects. It isn't just from Riyadh and Abu Dhabi. It's coming from elsewhere in the region. As I said, Turkey is certainly an unusual one. What does that do to your calculations if you are Ayatollah Ali Khamenei in Tehran? And I hope we get to that point as well. What does it do to U.S. interest in the region? How does the U.S. go about playing its cards? On the one hand, we are told that we're sort of helping Iranian efforts in Iraq in the fight against ISIS, and yet I read in my Washington Post paper this morning that the U.S. is providing Saudi Arabia with intelligence hitting the Houthis in Yemen. So that's just a bit of an overview. I'm going to be joining the rest of the panel, and I, as I'm sure you do, look forward to the discussion. We have about 8 minutes each. If you don't mind standing here at the platform so everyone can see you. Harith, would you start, please? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Middle East Institute. Pleasure to be here. I will comment on the Iranian role in Iraq. The U.S.-Iranian competition / coordination in Iraq, and the perceptions, if there's enough time, the perceptions of the Iraqi different factions of the Iranian role. I think understanding the Iranian role in Iraq is key to understand Iran's engagement in the region today. Nothing reflects how the regional balance of power has changed in the region as the Iranian role in Iraq. If we refresh our mind and try to remember that in the 80s, Iraq and Iran had been engaged in 8 years long bloody war, in which Saddam Hussein regime portrayed Iraq as the country that defended the Arab nation against the Iranian attempts to export the Islamic Revolution. Today, the Iraqi government is highly dependent on the Iranian help in fighting its enemies, in fighting ISIS. The Iraqi government has strong connections with the Iranians. In fact, Iran and Iraq are the only two regional countries who condemned the Saudi airstrikes in Yemen, which explains also that even their foreign policies are getting very close. So the main question that is often raised here is what exactly the Iranians want in Iraq. I think the Iranian objectives changed throughout the last 12 years, from making sure Iraq will not be led by a pro-Western government, which is unfriendly to Iran, into trying to bring Iraq completely into the Iranian axis in the region. And I think the Iranians succeeded in achieving the first goal, but they started to understand the difficulty of achieving the second goal, especially if they want to keep Iraq united. This leads me to ask another question about how the others perceive the Iranian role in Iraq. I will focus here on the US. I think also US also moved from an ambitious policy to build a pro-American government in Iraq that is at the same time democratic and inclusive, to a more realistic policy that aims to check and contain the Iranian influence and at least to keep it confined to its current level. We saw this playing in the military operations against ISIS, as the US tolerated some level of the Iranian engagement, especially in operations implemented in the areas surrounding Baghdad, or has a Shia majority, or perceived as part of the Shia sphere of influence in Iraq. But the two countries had their disagreements, especially about how to manage the war against ISIS and about the post-ISIS phase, although both of them always tried to keep those disagreements under control. From the beginning, the US policy focused on restructuring Iraqi army and building a Sunni military force initially called the National Guards to play the role previously played by the awakening groups, the Sunni awakening groups, fighting ISIS without causing further sectarian tension and holding the ground once ISIS forced out of the areas it controlled. But for the Iraqi government and for the Iranians, the idea was problematic because they felt it might lead to forming a kind of Sunni Peshmerga that will be difficult to control. The Iranians instead focused on empowering Shia militias, especially those that were formed, funded, and trained by them, such as the Badr organization, Asa'ib al-Haq, Hezbollah battalions, and other groups. They also tried and succeeded to give those militias a leading role within the army of volunteers that was formed after the fatwa of Ayatollah Sistani in June 2014, which is called the Force of Popular Mobilization. So at this point, the political competition between Iran and the US in Iraq is concentrated on the shaping of the military buildup in the country. We saw in Tikrit's operation that is still going on today. The US was initially reluctant from backing the operation, especially because of the role played by General Qasem Soleimani, the commander of the Al-Quds force in the Revolutionary Guards, and by the Shia militias. Only when Soleimani went back to Iran and was no longer in charge of the operation, the US airstrikes in Tikrit were resumed. So let me comment finally on the perceptions of Iraqi factions on the Iranian role. Apparently, the Kurds are not pleased to see the Shia militia empowered and moving north. In fact, it was Masroor Barzani, the Kurdish leader, who said before General Petraeus that he thinks the Shia militias are a bigger threat than ISIS, mainly because the Kurds don't want an Iranian-backed, organized, and effective force to contest Kurdish Peshmerga's control in the so-called disputed areas. The Sunnis, the Arab Sunnis in Iraq, don't trust Iran. They consider Iran their main enemy, but Sunni Arabs remain divided, and it is difficult to talk about a clear and well-established Sunni agenda. And with ISIS still in control of major Sunni cities, it is hard to see an effective Sunni leadership in the short term. For the Shias, I think Iran is more popular than it ever was among the Shia population of Iraq. Many of them think that ISIS was actually built and armed by US allies in the region. But while most Shia factions agree that Iran is their best friend, they have different perceptions about the Iranian role and the future of the Iranian role in Iraq. Some leaders like Hadi al-Amiri, the leader of the Badr organization, Qais al-Khazali, the leader of Asa'ib al-Haq, and to a lesser extent, the former Prime Minister Nour al-Maliki, are today very close to Iran. Shia militias fight on the Iranian side in both Iraq and Syria, and they don't even differentiate between the interests of the two countries. On the other hand, you have Prime Minister Abadi and the Supreme Islamic Council led by Ammar Hakim, who want to balance Iraq's relation with the US and Iran and make sure not to be perceived solely as US allies or Iranian allies. Finally, there's Muqtada Sadr, who surprisingly seemed very suspicious of the Iranian role. He gave several statements criticizing what he called the rude militia, in reference to Iranian-backed militias, because he perceives Iranian-backed militias as competitors, and that's why he's not comfortable with the Iranian role, but this by no means he became on the American side. I think relations between Iran and Iraqi Shias is much more complicated than it seems, and there are different dynamics influencing those relations. Just recently, when an advisor of President Rouhani stated that Baghdad was always the center of the Persian Empire and should become so again, there was a strong reaction by Shia factions and by the Shia Marja'iyya. The representative of Sistani in Karbala said that while we appreciate the help by our neighbors, we don't want them to violate our sovereignty. So the Shia Marja'iyya, the Shia clerical authority, although had long historical relations with Iran and Iranian religious circles, it wants to maintain Iraq's independence and its own independence as the historical center of Shiism in the world. In conclusion, I think Iran will always be influential inside Iraq, and as long as Iraq is a democratically ruled country, it will choose to have very good relations with Iran. The others, especially the Sunni Arab states in the region, have to come to terms with that. At the same time, Iraq is very big and complicated to be singly dominated by the Iranians. And it is better for the Iranians in the long term to focus on playing a constructive role that stabilizes the country rather than seizing the moment to turn Iraq into a battlefield for its wars with regional and international rivals. And here I stop. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me nonetheless, even if I'm the wrong one. I just want to make a few brief remarks about how the Iran-Gulf relationship, and I want to step back a little bit and focus on some things that somehow get lost in the day-to-day drumbeat of news of the latest disaster, the latest IRGC general striding across the landscape, or the latest bombing raid by the Saudis and so forth. So I'm going to make 2 or 3 brief points and wrap up with a complaint and a plug. First, when Iranians and Gulf Arabs gaze at each other across what will remain both the Persian and the Arabian Gulf, I think they see some things we don't focus on so much. And they don't tend to focus on the same things as we do or as the Israelis do. First, I think competition, as you know, all of you know in this room, competition for influence between Iran and Gulf states is nothing new. The Shah was a key element in our calculation of balance of power long before the revolutionary or the revolution in Iran. And certainly we viewed him as a counterweight to the ascension of power by the Sunni Arabs in the Gulf, who we were afraid would be a threat to Israel. And we had to fight for AWACS, for Saudi Arabia. Remember that fight? And it came down to really a couple votes. So, we've been playing this game of counterweights in the Gulf for a long time. It's nothing new, and we shouldn't treat it as something new and different. It's not that different regardless of the players. And a lot of the players haven't changed. Second, there's a great deal more interaction between the Gulf and Iran than people realize. You can get on a plane 5 times a day in Dubai and fly to Iran. And people do. Unlike Americans who think it's a big deal to go to Iran, and we have so few like Randa who actually go there. The people in Dubai go back and forth. People in Kuwait go back and forth. They have religious connections. They make pilgrimages. They have businesses operating both in the Gulf and in parts of Iran. They have family members. They have social connections, etc. 95 countries have embassies in Tehran. 2 countries don't, Israel and the United States. All 6 Gulf countries have embassies there. They have relationships, in other words, that we think is so foreign because since I entered the Foreign Service in 1979, we've thought of Iran as some sort of pariah. Some sort of state that was sort of the magic kingdom out there rather than a real country. Whereas the countries of the Gulf and the countries of Europe and elsewhere, and China and India and other places, treat Iran as pretty much a normal place. Also, I think it's a mistake to think of a GCC view of Iran. There is no GCC view of Iran. The GCC is made up of 6 countries, all of whom have specific histories, specific national interests, and have differentiated views of Iran and different types of relationships. The comparison of Dubai, for example, with Saudi Arabia, or the UAE with Saudi Arabia, there's no comparison at all. There's thousands of expat Iranian businessmen who live in Dubai. The Emiratis would be delighted to see sanctions go. They'll make millions. They will make more money than anybody in the world the day sanctions come off. And whereas the Saudis, they detest the idea of giving any quarter at all to this Iranian regime. Oman, of course, has already made it clear, we're not doing it. If you think you're going to strike Iran as a GCC, you're doing it without us. They made that quite clear. They've been intermediaries with the Iranians for us. And so there's a quite different population, or quite different view there. In Kuwait, where I was, I had an intern do some research for me for this presentation, and she came across this Wikipedia entry that said, Iranians in Kuwait. And she sent me this list of Iranians in Kuwait. And it was all these families that have been in Kuwait for hundreds of years. They're no more Iranian than I am. But there's still this perception, and somehow, that they're Iranian. These are Kuwaitis, and they're more Kuwaiti than Iranian Americans are Americans. There's no hyphenation of Shia populations. They're not Iranian Bahrainis or Iranian Saudis or Iranian Kuwaitis. They're Kuwaitis. Whereas in the United States, they're still Iranian Americans, even though they're very well integrated, in some cases better integrated than Shia populations in parts of the Gulf. But the key point to remember here is these populations have historical roots. They're not new. They're well established. The third general point I'd like to make involves threat perception. And in the Gulf, threat perception is sort of a different animal than it is for us think tankers who sort of mull it over and think about the nature of international threats and so forth. Threat perception and fear of various threats is sort of the guiding principle of their existence. You know, what's gonna kill me? Or who's gonna kill me? Is basically the guiding principle of a Gulf monarchy. How do I survive in a very dangerous world? So fear is the organizing principle. Not progress, not imagination, not change, certainly not change, but the fear of change and the management of change when it comes. So I think we have to think of that from their point of view. And stability, of course, is the main organizing principle. They fear a nuclear agreement in the GCC, especially the Saudis. Others, I don't think, fear it as much. But they fear the nuclear agreement not because they care about nuclear proliferation, not because they think they're going to have to get nuclear weapons. It's because they think it will open the doors to a normalization of relations with the West and the rest of the world, and Iran. And Iran will become a normal player and will be used by the West to balance against their interests in this region, in the old balance of power. And the president has done sort of awkwardly confirmed this belief in calling for more of an equilibrium in the region. But it's also wrapped up in doubts about the U.S. commitment to them. It's wrapped up in conspiratorial theories about the U.S. being in league to place Shias in power all over the world, and to reduce the influence and the general rejection of the idea that any political change is a good idea. It's at a time when they forget that the military balance is vastly in favor of the Gulf. Vastly. I mean, we think of these sort of Iranian Revolutionary Guard as supermen, you know, striding across Iraq, and Hezbollah striding through Lebanon, as if they're supermen. These guys are basically guerrilla fighters who are using the tools they have to disrupt the current order. They do not present an existential threat to anybody in the Gulf or to anybody outside the Gulf. They have not been able to acquire in Iran any sophisticated weapons since 1980. They have no air force. I mean, in 2009, our beloved General Petraeus said the UAE Air Force alone could wipe out the Iranian Air Force in an afternoon. So the military balance is completely, and we dumped billions of dollars worth of sophisticated equipment into the Gulf over the last 10 years. Billions and billions and billions, some of which is finally getting used. So the dissonance between reality and perception here is startling. You know, if an Iranian defense planner looks across the Gulf, what does he see? He sees Star Wars. You know, he sees all this coverage by the American umbrella. He sees all these planes. He sees all these ships. And what has he got? He's got some pretty good rockets, and he's got some pretty good speedboats. You know? And that's his advantage as a defense planner, and the ability to fight. And that may be an advantage that's important to him. The ability and the willingness and the political will to send IRGC into conflicts and to actually have them fight and die. I think this dissonance is growing, but it could be, I think, perhaps diminished by the willingness of the Saudis and others to start to use the force and to start to have the confidence to use force on their own, and not with our permission or, you know, our full acquiescence, but to defend themselves in the way they see fit. And so I'm not worried about their movement in Yemen, for example, and I am not in the least concerned of when they let us know that they were going to do this, as if that were important. Did they call us at 11, or did they call us yesterday and tell us they were going to do this? How this becomes a press story, I don't know. They decided, as Saudis, that they had an interest, that they were going to defend, and they went out and did it, and they asked for some help. I think that's a story, but I don't think it's a story about the lack of U.S. influence. I think it's a story about the exact opposite. We helped these countries get themselves capably armed. Now they're capably armed, and they're using those arms to defend their interests. We're shocked. Shocked. I think the area is evolving towards a new defense arrangement. The U.S. will continue to be involved heavily, and our partners will be more mature. There are some people that say it's time to think about a formal alliance with these countries. I disagree with that. These are countries with which we share interests, not values. And so I think we don't share the kinds of values that are necessary to form a formal alliance. I do think, and here's my complaint, and then I'll make the complaint brief, and then I'll make the suggestion. I get so tired of the term reassurance, that the United States has to do more to reassure our Gulf allies that we're on their side. I mean, the president and his whole national security apparatus and the whole national security leadership of 5 presidents back goes to Riyadh, and they're still not reassured. These guys didn't show up in Tehran, they showed up in Riyadh. And the call for greater dialogue. I've been part of these dialogues. Dialogue in the kingdom is between the king and the leader. If some of you have been in these military dialogues, the military man in the Gulf does not say anything. He smiles. He doesn't have any authority to talk about policy options or policy contingencies because he has no idea what those might be until he's told by the leader. So the notion that dialogue is going to solve our problems in the Gulf is nonsense. Mature leadership in the Gulf that empowers people at lower levels to actually lead will solve some of the problems. My push, my pet project. I'm tired of talking about leaders and problems. Just sick to death of it. We need to be talking about people. We don't know a Houthi from a Zulu. Anybody know really what a Houthi is? Is there somebody in here that's an expert on Houthis? We got one guy back here. Out of this whole crowd of Middle East experts, one guy that's willing to say knows anything about Houthis. That scares me. And that tells me that where we have to spend our money now and spend our effort now is on people. We have to double our exchange program now. We have to do 10 times more things like Randa's doing. And we have to really start over and start learning about all the things we forgot when we went into Iraq, when we talk about Iran, and when we conduct our policy in this blind alley of press clippings and what happened in the headlines today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Randa.
Thank you, Alex, for the invite. It's really a tough act to follow after Harith and Richard, what I've been asked to talk about is Iran's role in Syria. And I said, we cannot discuss Syria without discussing Lebanon. And then when I was writing my notes, and Alex said it's 8 minutes, I said, well, let's talk about Syria only. So I will talk about Syria, and then in the question and answer session, I can talk about Lebanon and Iran's role there, having just come from the region, a long visit to the region, talking with different officials about what's going on there. I will be addressing 3 points in my presentation. First is the drivers of Iranian policy in Syria. 2 is the future directions of Iran's Syria policy. And 3 is the impact of a P5+1 Iran nuclear deal on Iran's policies in Syria, if any. So drivers, I think the drivers of Iran's Syria's policy have been the same from the beginning. They haven't changed, and there are 4, and they are in descending order of priority. The first one is to defend an old ally. The Assad regime has been Tehran's only consistent ally since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, standing by Iran's side during the Iran-Iraq war. And when you talk with Iranian officials as well as with Iraqi, Lebanese officials who are close to Iran, this whole issue of standing by your ally is a big item on their agenda. And I think there is this issue of loyalty to an old ally that stood by Iran in the old day, I mean, especially in the Iran-Iraq war when everybody else was ganging up against Iran. The second driver is to preserve the weapons conduit to Hezbollah and the strategic depth the Assad regime has always provided for Hezbollah. I'll never forget what one senior Hezbollah official said to me in 2007. He said, think about us fighting the 2006 war against Israel with somebody like Hosni Mubarak to our back, in terms of, and he was making a comparison between Hamas fighting in Gaza against Israel versus Hezbollah fighting against Israel in Lebanon. The difference with Hamas having Hosni Mubarak to their back, and the difference with Hezbollah is having Assad to their back, and that's something that is important for the Iranians and for Hezbollah, and I think that's one of the main reasons they are fighting for Assad, much less the weapons conduit, which I think there are alternative routes to that. It's more the strategic depth that's more important as far as they are concerned. The third driver is this fight against, again, both Hezbollah and Iranian officials see the fight in Syria and in Iraq as part of of standing up against a regional Sunni extremist coalition that primarily aims to weaken the governments of Iraq and Syria in the objective of containing Iran's ideological and geopolitical status in the Levant. And so as such, Iraq and Syria increasingly are seen as part of one military theater in which this fight against the Sunni coalition is being waged. And the fourth driver is the long part of Iran's long game in Syria, which is to prevent the emergence of an anti-Shia, anti-Iran Sunni sectarian regime should Assad fall. And the only difference in terms of drivers, in fact, over time, is that we have seen over time this initially Iran and Hezbollah, officials in both Hezbollah and Iran, went to great lengths to make a distinction between supporting the Syrian regime versus supporting Assad, basically hinting that their interests lie in supporting the Syrian regime and not necessarily fighting for Assad's political survival. And I think after this continued for the first 6 months of the revolution, and I think by the 7th month, this is when I was told the debate inside Iran about this was settled by the supreme leader himself, and then the decision was to start looking at Syria through ensuring the political survival of Assad himself. And increasingly, this now has become the driver of Iranian policy, which is to see Assad in power, and partly because they don't see an alternative to Assad that is trustworthy and credible to Iran, as was the case in Iraq with Maliki. In Iraq, they could live with anybody from Dawah, almost anybody from Dawah or from Iski as a replacement to Maliki. I don't think they have that kind of penetration inside the Alawite community, and definitely they don't have that kind of trustworthy candidates to replace Assad inside the military or the service structure or inside. Now, there is this work that is being done with the National Defense Forces in Syria, which are Alawite paramilitary organization. And eventually, if there is a leadership to substitute for Assad in Iran's eyes, it's going to be it has to emerge from that core rather than from any other part of the Syrian government. Now, Iran's Syria policy has not come without high cost for Iran and for its regional allies. And so the question that you hear more and more in the region, especially in the camp that is opposed to Iran, is how long can Iran sustain this policy? In terms of cost, we can talk about financial cost. There have been at least 2 lines of credit extended by Iran to the Damascus regime, one in the amount of 3 billion, another one in the amount of 1 billion. And then recently in Lebanon, I was told there will be another 4 billion line of credit that will be extended to Damascus by Iran. There is, on top of that, all the kind of material and financial support to Syrian pro-regime militias, to Hezbollah, to Iraqi Shiite militia, on top of all this money that's being extended. In terms of human resources, human losses, Iran has lost so far at least 100 IRGC members, including recently General Muhammad Ali al-Dadid, who was killed in the Israeli airstrike in the Syrian Golan Heights. Now, based on unofficial estimates, Hezbollah's loss losses have exceeded 1,000. While in absolute terms, I mean, this casualty rate might look small, but for groups like Hezbollah, a loss of 1,000 fighters, including senior and seasoned commander, is no small matter. You know, I always tell people, Lebanon Shias are not the People Republic of China. And so the pool of potential fighters from which Hezbollah can draw is small. And so at some point, there is a casualty rate beyond which, for Hezbollah, beyond which its deterrence capabilities vis-a-vis Israel will be affected. I don't know what is this casualty rate. I don't know how far away we are from reaching that casualty rate, but I would expect we are not that far off from reaching that casualty rate. There is also the reputational cost. Wherever you travel in the region, especially in Sunni communities, the Islamic Republic of Iran now is the Shiite Republic of Iran. And so that kind of aura which Iran has gained early because of Islamist credentials, because of its support of the Palestinian cause, have pretty much dissipated among even Sunni Islamist constituencies, not Salafis, not Jihadis, Sunni Islamist constituencies, which considered Iran, and especially the revolution in Iran, as an ally in the past. Now, going forward, I don't see Iran policy in Syria changing in the short to medium term. Again, based on recent conversations with officials in Iraq and Lebanon who are privy to the Iranian regime thinking, they view Iran more likely to continue with its policy of propping the Assad regime with weapons, material, and financial support. Hezbollah is likely to be stuck in Syria for the foreseeable future, both with its military involvement as well as the Shiite Iraqi militias. The picture one is getting from these officials is that from Iran's perspective, its Syria policy has paid off, and this is the arguments they offer. Assad is still in power, despite all the money, all the effort that are being put to defeat him or to kick him out of power. He's still there. And for Iran and for Hezbollah, Assad is increasingly beholden to them for his political survival. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Hezbollah, Iran-Assad relationship, but Assad was not viewed as that trustworthy ally, in the past, and he has always tried to maintain that distance from both Hezbollah and Iran while playing these different cards, the Israeli negotiation card, the US negotiation card. And now Assad is increasingly beholden to both Iran and Hezbollah for his political survival. The international community, they argue now, is focused on fighting Daesh and not fighting Assad. This is something that Iran has been pushing from the beginning. And Hezbollah and Iran are gaining a foothold on the Golan Heights, basically almost encircling Israel, Gaza through its support of Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and now in the Golan Heights on the southern front. So from that perspective, again, officials who are privy to the thinking inside Iran is that this military option has not been exhausted, and more importantly, they are viewing the tide of the war shifting in their favor. Now, eventually, there will be a time for a negotiated solution in Syria, and this time will eventually come. We don't know when and in what shape Syria will be, but because of all the investments in Syria, Iran has earned a place at the negotiation table that will decide the future of Syria. And definitely there will be no sustainable solution of the Syrian conflict without Iran's involvement. Iran has advanced a political plan called the 4-point plan last March, and quickly I'll go through the 4 points. The first point, prioritizing fighting terrorism in Syria. Second, provision of immediate humanitarian aid. Third, reinforcing the political track and facilitating comprehensive talks to achieve a political solution. And fourth, boosting talks at the regional and international levels. The problem is that the situation has moved, the dynamics of the situation have moved so much on the ground in Syria. It's going to be hard to imagine how this plan, which Iran has advanced, could be put back on the negotiation table. And that's, I think, going to be the struggle going forward. Now, impact of a nuclear deal. The P5-1 negotiations with Iran have not addressed the regional file, particularly Syria, for two reasons. One is this fire firewall, which the US insisted on putting between the nuclear file and the regional file. But second, as Alex said earlier, the Iranian team taking part in the nuclear negotiation does not have the mandate to negotiate Syria with the Americans and with the Europeans. There might have been side conversations, but I don't think substantive negotiation have taken place between the US and Iran and the European about Syria. Now, what's the view in the region, in the Middle East? What will a nuclear deal do in affecting whether it will affect or not Iranian Syrian policy in the short term? I think you can divide the opinions into two groups, basically into two camps. There is a camp which says that it's unlikely to change, that there has been too much investment and sacrifice that have gone into implementing this policy for Iran to change tack in Syria, and that as long as Iran is excluded from regional and international negotiation about Syria, Iran will continue to play the spoiler role. And then there is also the argument that, in fact, a deal will free up a lot of financial resources for Iran to invest in Syria and to continue propping up the Assad regime. That's one camp that looks at how the deal will impact the Syria policy. On the other hand, it is increasingly costly. This policy, Syria policy for Iran, is becoming increasingly costly, especially the financial support. Militarily, Assad is about to lose, and his forces are about to lose, a third provincial capital. Idlib has now been surrounded by all sides. So it will be, if he were to lose Idlib, it will be the third after Al-Raqqa and Deir Zur. On the southern front, the regime forces have lost Busra Sham in the fight against a coalition of FSA and Jabhat al-Nusra. And so militarily, there is this increasing realization, even among the Hezbollah crowd, that Assad will not be able to hold the fort for long without, if Hezbollah, the Iraqi militia, and the Iranian advisors were to get out of Syria. And so the question is a question of mission creep. How long are you willing to keep propping up a regime that will not be able to regain the territory it's lost and to hold the territory it gains in a battle here and there? So the arguments also, you hear that a nuclear agreement will then, that is endorsed by the Supreme Leader, will strengthen the position inside Iran of the Rouhani Zarif camp and free the resources inside the foreign ministry, especially free Mr. Zarif time to devote more of his energy, time, negotiation skills to resolving conflicting issues like Syria. The question we'll have to do is with the debate inside Iran. Alex and Alireza are more experts about that, but the view, at least in the short to medium term, about Iran in Syria is that it's going to be more of the same. And that as long as there is no alternative to Assad, as long as they believe that the fight in Syria and Iraq are part of this regional Sunni-led conspiracy, and I think the development in Yemen reinforced that kind of mindset, I think they will keep investing more and more efforts and money and resources into the fight to prop up Assad. Thank you.
Thank you, Randa. Alireza?
Good afternoon. Thanks to the Middle East Institute for inviting me to speak. Thank you, Alex. I just want to briefly talk about what we can expect from Iran after a nuclear deal. And of course, we don't have a deal yet. It appears that we're probably closer to a deal than we have ever been, but it's not done until it's done. But let's assume there is a nuclear deal between Iran and the P5+1. How does that impact domestic politics in Iran and foreign policy in Iran? And I think a key question here is whether a nuclear deal is transactional or transformational. When I say transactional, does Iran basically have what the United States and its partners want, and vice versa? If Iran makes concessions on the nuclear program, will it meet sanctions relief and that's it? And we can't really expect much more from Iran? Or is this going to be some sort of a transformational deal that will allow Iran's President Hassan Rouhani and centrist figures in Iran, and the reformists and the Iranian people to make fundamental changes in Iran. And I think it really depends on who you ask within Iran, who you ask among the Iranian elite, because among the elite, there are different visions for what Iran should look like in the future. When we look at Hassan Rouhani, yes, he shares the same goals as Ayatollah Khamenei, the leader, the viability and survival of the Islamic Republic, but they have different tactics. And even before Rouhani became president, he was a national security expert, and he wrote a lot on foreign policy. And he asked in his writings, what do we want the Islamic Republic to be? Do we want it to be a normal nation state or a cause? And I think that people like Rouhani want Iran to be more like a normal nation state. And if you look at Rouhani, he's a seasoned, relatively pragmatic, non-ideological politician. He's very adept at diplomacy. He has been educated in the West. He speaks English. His foreign minister and his officials are very polished. So he has a different vision for Iran, an Iran that protects the revolution, but is less isolated and less ideological. Now, if we look at Ayatollah Khamenei, the leader, I would think that he thinks Iran is more than a nation state, that Iran is a cause. And so he is wedded more to an ideology of resistance against the United States and a more revolutionary ideology. This doesn't mean he can't make pragmatic decisions, because him supporting nuclear negotiations, I think, is quite pragmatic, but he has a very different vision for Iran. And we shouldn't forget that in 2009, the different visions of Iran fought a major struggle for Iran's future. When Iran had what was widely believed to be a fraudulent presidential election and millions of Iranians came out into the streets, this was a fight about Iran's future. And that fight is not over. Of course, we don't have people in the streets. We didn't have a revolution. But there are still major divisions in Iran, especially between these different factions, the centrists and the more conservative figures, represented in a lot of ways by Rouhani and Ayatollah Khamenei. And the conservatives in particular are very worried that this is going to be a transformational nuclear deal. They don't want Rouhani to be empowered so much that he can even think about reforms. And if we look at the last 2 years of Rouhani's presidency, he hasn't touched domestic reforms, and he hasn't made changes in foreign policy because he's waiting to make this deal and see where he can go. And so the trend right now tells us that the conservatives in Iran are going to fight Rouhani's ambitions, if he has ambitions to change Iran. And I think that's an open question. But the conservatives are going to fight any sort of transformation in Iran tooth and nail, and they have said as much. They have said that they're not going to allow the sedition, the Green Movement, and the reformists to come back to power in Iran. So if we look at the situation today, my best guess is that the nuclear deal is going to be transactional, because the people who wield power in Iran do not want a transformation of Iran. Could other things happen that could lead to transformation in Iran? Yes, potentially, the death of the leader, a number of other events, but I don't think the nuclear deal alone will achieve that. So fundamentally, I don't think Iran's relations with the United States will change, and I think Iran's relations with the Arab world flow from its relations with the United States. And I'll talk about Saudi Arabia because I think it's the most crucial actor for Iran in the Arab world. And as the ambassador said, Iran has very different relations with the GCC countries, with Oman, Bahrain, Kuwait. But its outlook toward the Arab world is shaped by Saudi Arabia. So how do Iranian officials feel about the Saudis? We know how the Saudis feel about Iran, that their primary motivation is fear. I would argue actually that Iran's primary motivation when it comes to Saudi Arabia is fear as well. Iranian officials and a large segment of the population most likely think of Saudi Arabia as a challenge, if not a threat. And there are different magnitudes of the Saudi challenge. Iranian officials will say Saudi Arabia is an economic competitor. It keeps oil prices low. This hurts Iran. Some will argue that Saudi Arabia is a geopolitical competitor and is trying to dominate the Persian Gulf, for example. But I think when you look at the relationship, the root of the competition between the two countries is religious and ideological. Both countries, both political systems really, are vying for leadership in the Muslim world. And the Islamic Republic does not want to present itself only as a protector of the Shia. According to the Islamic Revolution and Iran's political system, the leader is the leader of all Muslims and not just the Shia. Iran has pan-Islamist aspirations, and the Iranian officials think that the Saudis want to undermine Iran because of these aspirations. I spoke to a really well-connected Iranian academic recently, more aligned with the centrist camp, and he said there's a perception in Iran among all groups that Saudi Arabia has built an infrastructure in the Middle East to undermine Iran. That if you look anywhere in Iran's neighborhood, the Saudis are funding groups that are anti-Iranian and anti-Shia. And this is a claim the Saudis make against Iran. So very broadly speaking, Iran perceives Saudi Arabia as a major threat. Now, there are different ways of handling this threat. The Rouhani government thinks that improving relations might help, that diplomacy, détente, a rapprochement between the two countries can help Iran achieve some of its goals in the Middle East, that the two countries don't have to be black and white enemies. Whereas other Iranian officials, especially conservatives, especially within the Revolutionary Guards, believe in a more aggressive policy. And I think we see that aggressive policy across the Middle East, whether it's in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon. Iran sees what it's doing in these countries as a way to push not only against the United States, but Saudi Arabia as well. And I think this also shapes Iran's policy toward Israel, because Iran needs to present itself as a protector of the Palestinians. We can't really expect a less hostile approach toward Israel after a nuclear deal. I think actually we might see the opposite. We might see more Iranian assertiveness when it comes to Israel. I think fundamentally, no matter who's making decisions in Iran, Iran is benefiting from the collapse of the old Arab order. Iran can take so much in the Middle East, it can have so much influence because it's there for the taking. And when you look at Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, etc., these are weak states. And I think stronger nation states like Iran, like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, even Egypt are vying for influence in the region. So this isn't just about Iran trying to expand its influence and promote Shia revolutionary doctrine. I think in a lot of ways this is a classic fight between nation states as well. So I think in the short term, events have been good for Iran. It is arguably one of the most dominant powers in the Middle East, especially because it's willing to expend lives and resources and expanding its influence. It's willing to put Revolutionary Guards forces on the ground. But I think in the long term, Iran's policies carry risks. One risk is that Iran is no longer seen as pan-Islamist, that it is more isolated in the Middle East among the Sunni countries than it has ever been before. I mean, the Shia tend to look to Iran as a protector, whereas the Sunnis see Iran in very stark terms. And I think that sort of sectarianism, the policy of supporting just Shias, I think is very dangerous to Iran because the Middle East is dominated by Sunnis and not the Shia, and Arabs and not the Persians. So in the long run, I think this is a dangerous policy, but I also think that there's a danger here of Iran becoming overextended. Yes, there might be a nuclear deal. Yes, sanctions might be eased. The economy might improve in Iran. But this is a country with major problems. And I think the problems that we saw in 2009 have not gone away. Even if the economy improves, structurally, the Iranian economy is in a lot of trouble. Even when high oil prices were really high, the average Iranian did not benefit. Corruption is among the highest in the world. There is complete lack of political freedoms. There's a lot of societal pressure in Iran. And finally, the different factions in Iran that fought it out in 2009 have decided for now to get along with each other because they need a nuclear deal, they need sanctions to be lifted. But I think if there are other developments in Iran, if Ayatollah Khamenei passes away, then there's potential for great instability and great chaos in Iran as well. So, I would urge Iranian officials not to be so overconfident and think that they're ascendant in the Middle East right now, because things can change. And as we've seen, things can change very quickly. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you all very much. I hope everyone agrees. Wonderful presentations. I was asked to be the first one to ask a set of questions. I'll be brief, and let me start in the reverse order, if you don't mind. Let me start with Alireza. You talked about isolated Iran in the Middle East. It almost brought to my mind sort of the Israeli regional policy of focus on the periphery because your immediate neighbors aren't going to play ball with you. So you focus on the Chinas, the Japans of this world. That's what the Israelis are doing today. Is that realistically a scenario you could see play for the Iranians? I mean, you've already seen that Iranian trade over the last 10 years has shifted to the Far East. They don't trade with any of their immediate neighbors with the exception of Turkey. But before you answer that question, go back to September of 2013 when Ayatollah Khamenei turned around in a speech and he said, when it's needed, the nation that I am the captain of is allowed to perform what he calls heroic flexibility. What does he have to do, or what does he have to be confronted with, in your view, before he can see the need for heroic flexibility in terms of Iranian regional policies? Before you get to that, let me quickly go through the list and answer Randa a question, and then we'll start again with Alireza. Randa, you talked about the 4-point Iranian plan, and one of those points you raised is the political track. But then at the same time, you said it seems that the Iranians are committed to Assad's survival. So I'm wondering, what does that political track really amount to? But bring Russia into it. Could you see the Russians and the Iranians being the ones who could pull through with something like this? Ambassador, I'd love to see you do that presentation in Abu Dhabi one day. If you don't mind, I'll join you for that. But thank you. You talked about the threat perceptions for the GCC states. But what about this question that you often hear from the Gulf officials? That, look, if the United States doesn't come to our aid the way we think it should because we've been so loyal, then we'll go elsewhere. I don't take that seriously, but when you look at what they're doing in Yemen and the involvement of the Egyptians reaching out to the Pakistanis, the Turks, could you see, I mean, they don't have to go to China to find an alternative anymore. Is that something you could see pan out in the next few years as the region continues to be engulfed in various conflicts? And Harith, lastly, question for you. Coordination of foreign policy between Iraq and Iran sounds very interesting. And I think I'm not wrong in thinking the Iraqi foreign minister was in Syria. Who are the Iraqis doing this on the behalf of the Iranians, or is there sort of unilateral Iraqi desire and some Iraqi-centric objectives that are behind some of these moves? We see the Iraqis more upset than the Iranians about what's happening in Bahrain, in Yemen, and now with this visit to Syria. I'm just wondering, is this orchestrated, engineered from Tehran, or is Baghdad wanted to be the next big Shia power and it plays its cards according to its own interest? Anyway, and so please go ahead, Alireza, if we could start with you, and then we go to the group. Thank you.
So on the question of heroic flexibility, when Khamenei made that speech, that was basically the launch of very serious nuclear negotiations. And up until then, Khamenei had insisted Iran wasn't going to give up its rights, etc. But when Rouhani became president, Iran faced so much economic pressure, and I think Khamenei faced a lot of pressure from people like Rouhani, who argued with him, never in public, but who made arguments in public anyways, that we're in trouble and we need to be more flexible on the nuclear issue. Without giving up everything, we can be flexible on the nuclear issue. And I think that's what heroic flexibility means, but it doesn't really extend to other issues. Never mind domestic issues. I think when it comes to domestic issues, Khamenei's pretty much set on his way. Perhaps he realizes he shouldn't have backed Ahmadinejad for so many years, and that was a mistake. But in terms of how he sees Iran, that has not changed whatsoever. In terms of foreign policy, he even himself said during that heroic flexibility speech that the competition between the United States and Iran is not over. We're like two wrestlers, and wrestling is a very popular sport in Iran. But we're two wrestlers, and we're going to wrestle no matter what. But I'm going to show a little flexibility in order to win. So for him, I don't think there's any political benefit of having a normal relationship with the United States or Saudi Arabia or most of the Middle East for that matter, because Iran's foreign policies to a large extent are structural. And even when President Rouhani talks about changes in foreign policy, he always says within the structure set by the leader, within the structure of within the framework of the Islamic Republic. Now, I think there's precedent for better Iranian-Saudi relations because when Mohammad Khatami was president in Iran, and before him, Ayatollah Rafsanjani, Iran did have better relations with Saudi Arabia. Relations were manageable. I think the two sides still competed, but they could get along. And when Ahmadinejad became president, relations really declined. So is there a chance of seeing that again? Possibly. I think Rouhani and Zarif, the foreign minister, want better relations. After Rouhani was elected president, he gave a press conference and he talked about better relations with Saudi Arabia, and he bragged even that he had been the first Iranian official to sign a security agreement with Saudi Arabia. So the potential is there, but there are so many obstacles. Conservatives in Iran, the Saudi leadership, the nature of the sectarian conflict between the two countries. I think the zero-sum attitude the two countries have, that one side's gain is another side's loss. I mean, take Yemen as an example. On the issue of Houthis, if I can say one word about the Houthis in order to differentiate them from the Zulus, the Houthis were virtually ignored by Iran until recently. They're not 12 or Shia. I think their connections to Iran have been vastly exaggerated, unfortunately, by some of the media in this country. Iran took an interest in the Houthis when the Saudis started being worried about Iran taking an interest in the Houthis. Then Iran thought, wow, maybe we should help them. The Saudis are really worried about the Houthis. I don't think the Saudi attack against Yemen is actually because of fears of Iran. There are local conditions in Yemen. The Houthis were fighting the central government for a decade before Iran decided to help them. And these are localized fights. And I think governments in Saudi Arabia and Iran make these conflicts into overly sectarian issues. And I think they use sectarianism on both sides to punch above their weight in a lot of ways. But going back to your question about heroic flexibility, I think a lot of those relations are set. Right. I think there's potential for change, right, but not a lot of potential. On the question of Iran approaching Europe and Asia, I think it's because Iran's regional policies are so set that it has to look to Europe and Asia for economic relations, not strong political or security relations, but in order to improve Iran's economy. And I think that's what the Rouhani government is really trying to do, is to attract investment, improve the economy, not necessarily be anybody's best friend outside of the Middle East.
Thank you, Alireza. Randos.
Look, I think it's not only Iran, but all the regional actors that are involved in Syria, be it the Saudis, be it the Qataris, the Turks, the Iranians, are all paying lip service to the political track while engaging in behaviors on the ground, trying to supporting their proxies in the fight and hoping that their proxies will win and prevail eventually. And so the difference, this political process which Mr. Zarif's office proposed last March, that was before the presidential election in Syria. And it was to create some kind of a political environment in which eventually the elections could be part of the negotiation bargain. And then once the elections happen, the presidential election, and you have now a president who, according to Iranian officials I met, has been fairly elected. Now, the question of freely elected maybe is not up there, but they believe that he has been fairly elected and that he has to serve his term of 7 years. That it's very difficult to think of getting rid of him before, him serving his 7-year term. I think it's all still talk, and the problem for Iran is that it's stuck in Syria and it's going to remain stuck. I don't see the military situation changing much in favor or one side or the other. I don't think the regime can defeat the jihadis and the FSAs. I don't think the jihadis and the FSAs can defeat the regime. We are going to be in this kind of military stalemate for the foreseeable future until we have an intervention that will, change that military equation in favor of one side and hopefully not the regime side. So on Iran, on Russia, I think we are seeing an increasing distance between the Russian position and the Iranian position on Syria. I think Russia now is serious with its initiative to bring some kind of a political process between the opposition and the regime that can lead to a new power sharing formula in Syria, which does not necessarily include Assad. They have a second meeting that will take place on April 6th. The problem with the Russian initiative is that, again, part of the work we do at the Middle East Institute on Syria is that we have been now engaging in conversation with rebel groups, both on the northern front, on the southern fronts, in conversation with different constituencies inside Syria society that have to be part of a peacemaking process in the future. And the picture that we are developing also is that Russia is not seen on the ground, especially among the fighters, the pro-opposition fighters, as credible, as able to play a neutral mediating role. And the opposition people that Russia has been able to bring to its process really are not representative. They don't have any kind, except for the PYD maybe, they don't have any kind of weight on the ground inside Syria. So while there has been a distancing between Russia and Iran on the issue of Assad, again, the failure of Russia to force Assad to do any kind of concession, as part of the dialogue, is shining the spotlight on the limited leverage that Russia has over Assad, and that eventually the deal that will need to be made in Syria will have to include the Iranians. And again, more and more the Iranians look at the deal through a regional lens, that it has to be a deal that will include them at the table, it will include the Saudis at the table, it will include the Turks at the tables.
Thank you. Ambassador.
Your question was about whether the Arabs or the GCC could turn elsewhere for support. I think it could, and I think it should. I think it won't, partly because of practical reason, especially the Saudis, Emiratis, Qataris. They've enmeshed themselves in the labyrinth of American defense equipment acquisition, which once you get in is really hard to get out of because of all the follow-on maintenance contracts and all the ways which our very imaginative defense firms make sure you stay with them like a drug. So that's a practical consequence. They also, when you pick a Praetorian Guard, you pick the tallest and the most able and the most well-armed and the only superpower around. You don't pick some South Korea, as your guarantor of your security.
French Navy, maybe.
Maybe the French, maybe the British, but they've, I think, had their day, and I'm not sure they're too eager to repeat it. The Chinese certainly are not. It's fascinating how difficult it is. And we tried a little bit of this at the Atlantic Council. We tried to sort of interest the Chinese in talking about playing a more active role in Gulf security and just a transit of petroleum, which mostly goes to them now. No, that's not our problem. We got our own territorial waters. That's where our Navy is. We're not going out there. You guys do that. And so we'd be delighted. I've heard very senior U.S. Navy officials, when asked whether they'd like to see the Chinese in the Gulf, say, in the future. We asked, in the future, would you like to see this? And they said, no, we'd like to see it today. We've got too many obligations as it is. Come on. Send the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Chinese to play a role. And I think that is the future. I think that'll come eventually because the U.S., frankly, is not going to be interested in this region forever. We're not going to be the guarantor forever. Just because we're there now is, our interests are declining there. The petroleum flows have declined for a long time. The types of societies that these are not the types of societies that most Americans are comfortable with. And so I see eventually the trend that sort of started with this administration will continue, that somebody will have to come in and fill this vacuum, and it will be either the locals or the locals with new friends to accompany a sort of a informal defense umbrella from the United States.
Thank you, Ambassador.
On foreign policy, I don't think Iraq has a clear foreign policy agenda. I think there are different Iraqi foreign policies. You could talk about a Shia foreign policy, a Kurdish foreign policy. Kurdish officials used to receive the Syrian opposition in Kurdistan and talking to them. And Jafari, the Iraqi foreign minister, just dared to go to Damascus and met Bashar Assad. I think what we see today is what can be called the sectarianization of the Middle East and of the foreign policies of the Middle East. 30 or 40 years ago, nobody was talking about the Sunni world and the Shia world as the major categories in describing the Middle East. But now we are getting used to these categories because, as Reza said, we are facing a situation in which the post-colonial state, the nation state in the region is weak, and the national identity is weak, and therefore people going back to alternative identities, which is now the sectarian identity part of it. And this identification with the sectarian identity is fostered by the Saudi-Iranian geopolitical rivalry. Also, I think there is a coordination between the Shia elite in Iraq and the Iranian government regarding the foreign policy, but I don't think the Iranians dictating the behavior of the Iraqi Shia officials. But as Alex said, sometimes the Iraqi Shia officials seem more outspoken regarding the Shia issues in the region, in Bahrain, in Syria. And I think this is mainly because they are less experienced than the Iranian officials, and they just rush to express their attitudes because they are still thinking in a factional mindset, not as statesmen. And also because they speak Arabic, like the Iranians, and they understand Arabic, and they listen to the Arab media, which is heavily dominated by Sunni Arab countries, and they just want to react to what they listen because they think that the narrative presented by the Arab media is biased.
Thank you very much. We have a few minutes left, so if I could just start
Let's start in the corner. Can we take the questions in one go since we don't have that much time? Yourself first, Ambassador Mack, and then I think sir over there, and then my friend over there. So we got 4 questions. Hopefully everybody gets a question. Go ahead, please.
All right. Hi, my name is Anor, and I'm a student at George Washington. Mr. Ambassador, this is intended for you. I'd just like to thank you for your remarks. You talked about at the very end of your remarks about the importance of people and not really focusing on the top, but really sort of the bottom. I'd just like to hear a little bit more about that and what you can tell me about what sort of programs are being instituted or just general information about that lower part of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador.
Yeah, David Mack from the Middle East Institute. And my question is for both Richard and Harith. Can the Obama administration persuade the government in Baghdad of the need for a better relationship with the United States, partly in order to curb Iranian influence in their country?
Peter Humphrey, former diplomat, current analyst. The one thing that could torpedo everything would be an accidental bombing or strafing of a couple of dozen Pasdaran al-Quds forces. And I wonder, I have to suppose that there's some sort of deconfliction protocol going on right now, and I'm wondering if any of you could shed some light on that.
Great. And then last question.
I'm now
Abdullah
with Rudao. One question for Mr. Al Qarawee. You said the United States' goal in Iraq is no longer about establishing an inclusive and democratic state, but rather more realistic, containing Iran's influence. How is the United States going about doing that? How important is the role Kurds as a pro-Western group can play in achieving that? Thank you.
Thank you all. Who wants to go first? Ambassador, I think you got 2 questions.
I don't know anything about the second one, so.
Okay.
The first one. On people-to-people things, I really feel extraordinarily strongly about this, so I'm glad you gave me this softball question. We have very powerful programs, and I think there's a lot of ex-ambassadors here who know that the International Visitor Program that we have is one of the most powerful tools of public diplomacy in the world. Bringing people here for 3 or 4 weeks, bringing them out of their environment into various parts of the United States to interact with their peers, be it within in engineering, in politics, in economics, in education, in health. It's a tremendously powerful tool. Another is the Fulbright program. That's, has a history of success over the years and goes to the point I'm making about being stupid about the Middle East. I mean, we need 20 times more Fulbright scholars out there from the United States and 20 times more here. And these programs could be quadrupled with peanuts. The price of a third of a drone, would quadruple our cultural programs with the Middle East in a flash. We have the infrastructure to do that. We have the experience doing it. We know what works in influencing people. We don't do a very good job in following up with people. We have thousands and thousands and thousands of Arab graduates of American universities that once they pay their money and once they get their degree, we forget them. We act as if they never were there. And these people have a deep hunger for a connection with their universities. They have a deep hunger to tell you and relate their experiences in the United States. And we act as if they're, thanks for coming. The same thing with the IV program. Only recently has the State Department started to follow up with people who came here for a month and talk to them and engage with them over the course of their careers. But this is a tremendous asset, and I think of it in strategic terms as much as I think of an aircraft carrier in strategic terms. This is not nice to do stuff. This is not something you do because you've got a little extra money. This is not something to do because you got a lot of cultural people who want to send a ballet to, Riyadh. It's because it's in the strategic interest of the United States to understand the people of the United States and to create an environment in which those people understand us.
Can I just add to what he said quickly?
Sure.
Also, I think what we need to, especially for Congress, is to increase our allocations to American universities abroad. I mean, these are like the American University of Beirut, like the American University of Cairo. I mean, these are campuses, universities that really promote, liberal, progressive ideas and create spaces for people of all different persuasion to come together in the Middle East to think together about the future of their countries. And I think that's also a loss, is that we don't put money and assistance to these programs as much as we should.
Thank you.
There are two questions about the American foreign policy, so I will give one answer. I think, in addition to the fact that the Americans are tired of Iraq, they understand the limits of their influence in Iraq, and they understand that Iran has a strong influence, will be there for a while, probably for a long time, and they want to just make sure that Iran will not dominate Iraq. Iran will keep a level of influence that is confined to its current level. And the two countries, I mean, we are talking today about how surprising that the two countries are fighting on the same side. Actually, it's hardly a surprise. They were fighting, or they were on the same side in many other occasions, like in Afghanistan when the U.S. toppled Taliban, and in Iraq when the U.S. toppled Saddam's Hussein regime. Actually, Iran was the first regional country that recognized the Iraqi governing council that was formed by the Americans in 2003. So I think the two countries found ways to coordinate, but they will continue compete. And as I said in my talk, that the main point of the competition now is the military buildup of the Iraqi security forces. The U.S. want to restructure the Iraqi army to make it more inclusive, less sectarian, but it understands that it is hard to do that in a highly divided country, and there is very low levels of confidence between different factions. Of course, the Kurds, as you said, they are trying to tell the U.S. that they are their best friends and they should rely on them, but even the Kurds are not in their best position now. And on the one hand, they are facing ISIS. On the other hand, they have the problem of the budget with the Iraqi government. So each group in Iraq also facing many difficulties. And what the U.S. is trying to do is to make sure that this chaotic situation be controlled and produce a situation in which Iran remain influential but not dominant in Iraq.
Great. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, time is up. Although I am of Middle Eastern background, I grew up in Northern Europe, so I have to be punctual. Thank you all very much. I know there are a couple of questions, so we will hopefully have the panelists stick around for a few minutes. Thank you all very much for coming on a day that looked like to be more rainy than it actually ended up being. But I hope you all agree. We heard wonderful, rich insights and sharp analysis. Thanks again very much for coming.